Welcome to The Turning Point. I'm your host, Reverend Wendell Anthony, and we're here tonight, as we are always, and we're here to discuss the election of 2020. After 4 years, in some cases, not only 4 years, but 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, the long-awaited nightmare of the past administration is about to be over. And so we're glad that we have come to this point where in the city of Detroit and around the country, the nation, we have come to a point where we can move forward and deal with the new era that we now find ourselves in. That new era is, of course, an era in which people can breathe, they can understand what is going on. We can have a president that tells the truth, that is not afraid of dealing with science and with knowledge and with information. And look at all what we've come through. We've come through suppression of the vote. We've come through issues related to stopping the mail in the post office. We've come through long lines. We've come through elections being rigged, mail being disrupted, the fact that we've come through international nations interfering with our elections. We've come through a court system that has thrown out erroneous pronunciations and assumptions as relates to bogus and frivolous lawsuits that have been brought all across the country. And most recently here in the state of Michigan, we've come through the question of whether or not we're going to even certify our election. And this comes after 150 years where black people in America, particularly black men, got the right to vote through the 15th Amendment. We've come through 100 years of women and the 19th Amendment having the right to vote. We've come through 55 years of the Voting Rights Act since it was enacted, and folks are still acting like we don't have the right to vote. Here in Detroit and Wayne County, where black folk came out in numbers, people wanted to discount our vote. They wanted to suggest that somehow all the other votes should be certified, with the exception of the votes in Detroit. And not only Detroit, but Philadelphia, Atlanta, Milwaukee, places where black people are predominantly in the majority of the population, have come out in numbers. And for some reason, people just have not gotten the memo. As I say all the time, that we be free, y'all. We have paid the price. We've sweat too much, bled too much. We've run too much. We've walked too much. We've sacrificed too much for us not to have the right to vote. And so just recently, on yesterday, as a matter of fact, on Monday, November the 23rd, the Michigan vote was finally certified by a margin of 3-0. There was still one resistor who did not want to deal with an honor history. And we have a rogue president. For the next month and a half, we have to deal with him. A rogue president who has tried his best to make sure that he would remain in office illegally. And so tonight we want to talk about what we've just been through and what we still, the challenges that we still face, because in some cases we still may have a challenge. He has just said today, and today is Tuesday, November the 25th, that, matter of fact, he in fact would still try to disrupt this election. And so we want to make sure that we are not turned back. And so I'm pleased to have tonight as my guest the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, who's been on the forefront in this fight to preserve the right to vote and to preserve the votes in Michigan. Come up against attacks personally. I guess it's really a feather in your cap when the President of the United States calls you out and says everything bad about you, nothing good about you. And then my other guest is Attorney Melvin Bush Hollowell, who's a former general counsel for the Detroit branch NAACP, who was also a senior partner in the Miller firm, former corporation counsel, and also worked in the Gore issue when they were certifying or not certifying the ballots in Florida. So he has a lot of experience on this issue with regards to certification. So stay with us as we talk about Detroit and Michigan and the certification of the vote here in our state. Good evening to Attorney Hollowell and also to Jocelyn Benson.
Good evening, Reverend Anthony. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, Secretary of State Benson.
Good evening.
Good to have you, and thank you so much for joining with us. Let me start with Madam Secretary. We've just come to State Jocelyn Benson, and I want to go to Secretary Benson first, Butch, because as the Secretary of State, she's had her hand in all of this. I'm sure it's not something that she anticipated when she first got this office, but the right to vote is central to African Americans. It is at the very heartbeat of who we are. The NAACP, since 1909, voting has been part of its priority. You, Secretary Benson, have been with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and so you know something about disenfranchised people, because that's what the Southern Poverty Law Center addresses and deals with, how to make sure that people are living their life and that they're not taken advantage of. The song that we sing all the time, Lift Every Voice and Sing, talks about letting freedom ring, marching on till victory is won, and out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, true to our God and true to our native land. So when you look at this era, Madam Secretary, if you were to write a book, and perhaps you might be writing a book later on about it, how would you analyze it? How would you characterize the United States and Michigan and what we've gone through in these past weeks?
Well, thank you first, Reverend Anthony, for having me here, and I did hear you there, so thank you for your patience as well with the Zoom. I think that, what we've just lived through is a continuation of the work and the fight that has come before us in so many different ways, and it reminds us how the battle for the vote is never over. In fact, just yesterday morning, although it seems like so long ago, I listened for the first time to the speech that Dr. King gave on the steps of the Montgomery State Capitol building after the Selma to Montgomery March in March of 1965. And I was really struck by, one, just what a masterpiece it is. It's the one, as you all know, where he ends by saying, how long, not long, and the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But there was a part in it that talked about the work that continues, that never ends, but that to never forget that the work to ensure the right to vote underlies all other rights, as you know, and all other work. And of course, though there was so much work that occurred to ensure in so many ways that the voices of those who marched in Selma were heard, there was something he said in the speech that really resonated and underscored how connected we are to that time here, even today, 55 years later. He said, I stand before you this afternoon with the conviction that segregation is on its deathbed, and the only thing uncertain about it is how costly the segregationists will make the funeral. And that really struck me of how, I felt yesterday, where you say, we have the conviction that the election is done, the votes have been counted, yet we still have to fight to ensure that truth rules the day. But really, truly, we know it will rule the day. The only thing uncertain about it is how costly those seeking to silence the voices of Detroiters and Black voters all across the country would make the funeral of the attack on voting rights. And it really underscored how that battle continues today, but also how we must protect and ensure, even after we've won a particular battle, as the votes in Detroit and in Philadelphia and Milwaukee certainly showed people voted, voices were heard. Even after that victory, we still have to fight to preserve that victory even against those who would seek to simply make their own funeral more costly and deadly than it has to be. And truly what we've experienced over these past 3 weeks since the closing of the polls is simply that, an unprecedented attack on the sanctity of our democracy through the lens of trying to throw out the votes that were cast in Detroit, which was ultimately what the Wayne County canvass debate was about. And recognizing that fight, that even though that particular fight had been won, there still had work to be done. Voices still had to speak out to make sure those votes weren't taken away. But also, even though we knew, and I assured everyone, we would stand guard, the Attorney General and I, to protect everyone's vote no matter what, the only question was how many battles we were going to have to fight in order to win victoriously. And so, again, to me, this past month, this past year has underscored that that truth is on our side, that justice is on the side of those who fought for it for centuries. And yet the battle to secure and protect that justice is never done. It's never fully won as long as there are those out there seeking to take justice away, take votes away from those who, through citizenship and through ownership, rightly have that vote and that voice. When you we know the battles will continue as well. I think that's the other thing. We may have certified the election yesterday. We may be moving forward, but all that means is that we can take a breath and then prepare for the fight ahead, because the fight for justice is never fully done or won.
When you became Secretary of State, I'm sure you did not think you were going to be encountering this. The very blatant and in-your-face, we don't care, cavalier, almost a gangster move. That's what we call this in the community. This was a gangster move on behalf of the President of the United States and his cohorts to just take the vote and just to discount it and to target black folk. They did not target communities around Detroit where the imbalances were, in some cases, much more of an issue than they were in the city of Detroit. And yet we find ourselves in that city. Why do you think they were so blatant? Are we missing something to the fact that they would be this blatant with this issue?
You had Livonia, who had and we're talking just about the data from 2020. You had Livonia, which precincts were much more out of balance. Yet you actually had someone say that's, I'd entertain a motion to just throw out Detroit's votes. But it's also the same thing we saw in Philadelphia, in Milwaukee, that we're seeing still now through the recount in parts of Arizona, Maricopa County. There was a very targeted effort to disenfranchise citizens in African-American communities, black and brown voters who were specifically targeted through these nefarious misinformation campaigns and through efforts after the fact to disenfranchise or throw out the votes that were rightfully legally cast in these communities. And the other thing I saw firsthand, because I talked to folks who were at TCF. We were in Detroit on election day. I worked quite closely with the clerk, as you know, throughout the whole process, and saw her at the end of the day. She's actually done a significant, and her staff had done a significant amount of more work than ever before to recruit and train poll workers, to balance a lot of books. In fact, though in the past 58% of precincts were imbalanced in 2016, only 28% were imbalanced in 2020. And no one was complaining about it in 2016. But of course, here we are in 2020, and there's an effort to throw out the entire election for the city of Detroit based solely on these clerical errors. And again, noting that there were errors in plenty of other communities that weren't under attack. And so what it also shows is that that those who would seek to disenfranchise or silence the voices of our black and brown communities will take anything, even the most innocuous thing, as these clerical errors truly are. They're errors that we work out after the certification and fix at that point. But even so, they'll take anything as pretext to try to disenfranchise and disempower communities. And we have to continue to stay vigilant, essentially, which is what we did yesterday.
There's no question about that. There's no question.
Heroically was in the hospital. I don't know if you all saw at the State Board of Canvassers meeting, they tried to delay it because she was unable to attend due to health issues. And the extraordinary person that she is, she actually dropped everything in the hospital, found a way to zoom into the meeting just so that she could participate and not allow that to be used, her health to be used, or her family's health issues to be used as a reason to not certify, which we are in danger of potentially seeing happen.
That's what it requires, and it's so much. And Attorney Hollowell, you were in Florida, but this does not compare to Florida. I mean, just the blatant disregard. And Butch, I know they have been violating certain laws. I mean, just the ethics that's involved. You got a guy like Rudy Giuliani, who has not practiced in a courtrooms since the 90s, and he's leading the charge for the President of the United States, and he's getting whipped all around the country. They've thrown out case after case. What law? Where are we at, Butch? I mean, does the law still matter when it comes to black folk?
Well, the law does not matter as it relates to Rudy Giuliani and the president's legal team. They've lost time after time. In fact, it's been a national embarrassment. What you'll note is that none of the major law firms that typically do any kind of work as it relates to election law have touched any of the president's cases, because it'll destroy your reputation if you're even associated with these kinds of unsubstantiated, wild allegations that go unproven. In fact, a federal judge in Pennsylvania came just inches away from sanctioning Rudy Giuliani for the unsubstantiated way. But, let's take a step back. First of all, we have to be lucky that we have a Secretary of State like Secretary Benson. I don't think that Michigan has ever had a Secretary of State that is a specialist in election law. It's not a broadly, what we do is not a broadly practiced specialty, and that's her specialty. And so we should be grateful for that, and she was certainly very proactive.
Even though the president tried to castigate her and make it look like she didn't know what she was doing.
Well, just like you said, you can wear that like a badge of honor. Yeah. But what I'm saying here is, here's the big point on the law. The big point is the systems that we have in place that should be ordinary and routine were not. That should be ordinary and routine were not. And this means that they tried to turn upside down what should have been a very commonplace process. What do I mean by that? In the end, we don't have a direct democracy. A lot of people think we do, but we don't. Under our U.S. Constitution, Americans elect this electoral college. We don't actually vote directly for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. You vote for the people who are going to cast ballots on their behalf. So these are 538 people. In Michigan, Joe Biden picked 16 individuals. We have 16 electoral votes in Michigan. Why 16? Those are the number of the members of Congress plus the 2 U.S. senators that we have. We have 16. And so Joe Biden and Kamala Harris picked those 16. It's a winner-take-all system in every state except for 2 states.
But how they were talking about that the electors could make a different selection of electors if it came to a point where we got in a situation where they couldn't make a decision and it really was not who they wanted it to be.
It's really difficult to do that, and that would certainly be, there would be certainly a legal challenge for that, and there are some backstops. If somebody tried to play some games with that, in the end the governor could weigh in and say that the electors that were selected by President-elect Biden has to go into place. But so they'll all get together on December 14th, and they will cast their ballots, all of Michigan's 16 electoral ballots for Joe Biden. But the way that we got here now seems to suggest you've got a state board of canvassers. One member went rogue, and their power under state law 168.841 says you only have one job. Your only job as a state board of canvassers is to take the votes that the counties, the 83 counties in this state give you, and add them up. Do the math. You're not supposed to do anything else.
Yeah, but we had a hearing that was for hours
4 hours.
yesterday. So why are we having a hearing?
Because
4 hours when they have but one job.
yeah, you had one member that decided to go rogue. Now, fortunately, the other member did not decide to go rogue, and he ultimately ended up saying, you know, we can't exercise power that we don't have. We can't do investigations and all this stuff. So he tried to act up, but they ended up certifying the votes of the 83 counties. Before that, it wasn't routine either. At Wayne County, where at one point there are 4 members, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats on the State Board of Canvassers. In the end, they finally voted 3-1 to certify, so that went fine, and those names are now going to be forwarded on for the December 14 Electoral College. Before that, each one of the counties had to certify their votes. So Detroit is in Wayne County, and Wayne County Board of Canvassers, just like the Lake County Board of Canvassers and the Ingham County Board of Canvassers, have to do the same thing. There you had a little bit of drama, and you shouldn't have had it, you know, because you had 2 members that were saying we don't like this or we don't like that. And so they ended up changing their mind and certifying. But what does this tell you? This tells you that you can't take your eye off the ball. Thank goodness you have Reverend Anthony, the NAACP, and a lot of other challengers that are in place, which the law allows for, to say that we're watching you. And if you don't do your job, we're going to be in court the next day. And so it makes you step back and say, should we even have an electoral college? Should we have a system where you have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans where you have a built-in tie? Or should we do like some other states where if there is a tie and they don't certify, the governor steps in or a judge steps in? So it gives us an opportunity to rethink that. The Electoral College itself is an unfair college. It's an unfair part of the system. What it does is it gives more power to smaller states because Joe Biden won the popular vote by 6 million votes.
Right.
And yet, we're still doing this Electoral College thing.
And Hillary won it over by 3 million.
Hillary won by 3 million, and Joe Biden won by 6 million votes. And so it makes you step back and think, shouldn't we change that so that whoever wins the most votes should be elected? I personally, as an election lawyer, I think that's the case.
Secretary Benson, there's been a lot of talk about the audit, and there was some issue about auditing the whole vote and the state before certification, and as if that's going to find a whole lot of irregularities or ballots that should not have been counted, et cetera. What's your take on that? Are we now moving towards an audit, and was that just a delay technique? Are we compelled to do that by virtue of some agreement? And what does that mean? Does that leave us open now for another challenge, or is this a done deal?
That's such an important question because audits are really helpful just to make sure and confirm that the machines are accurately counting our ballots and identify any ways for us to improve in the future. And we've always been planning a statewide audit in every community where we evaluate and affirm that the machines are accurately counting the ballots. And now we'll also be doing the routine procedural audits in many communities. We've actually done 120 procedural audits all across the country in the past 2 years, all across the state in the past 2 years. And what those are, we'll do one in Wayne County, all across the county. That basically does look at any sort of bookkeeping and balance and looks to find an explanation as to why the number of people who signed into a precinct and the number of ballots may differ. It's typically a ballot gets jammed in a machine and then needs to be replaced or duplicated, or a voter makes an error, shows up to the wrong precinct, signs in, doesn't get a ballot, and then goes to another one and signs in there instead and gets the ballot there. And so all that does is we just need that. A procedural audit is just taking the time to look into that, into the poll books and see what happened and identify the errors. It's actually something that our staff really enjoys doing because it helps to clean up the process. So those audits actually happen after every certification of every election. What we saw this year was, again, it's always the pretext here. There was an attempt to use the audit as a way to delay the certification, which is nonsense because we can't do an audit until there's been certification because the State Bureau of Elections doesn't have access to the ballots or the poll books or anything else you need to actually do the audit. So we had to make that case. And that also, again, underscores why you just have to keep being proactive and never let your guard down. Just know that there are forces in play always trying to undermine or disenfranchise for political reasons or other reasons citizens in this state, and we have to continue to speak with the truth and the facts and the data, which in this case is actually that, number one, Detroit's elections were actually more well run this time because so many citizens chipped in and helped out with all the satellite locations and all the rest around the city. But on top of that, also we tell the truth, but that also we make sure that we are pushing back on any lies that are out there and affirming that through audits or otherwise that citizens can indeed trust the election.
As a result of what we did in 2020, I know you have learned and acquired some new insight as to how to run elections based upon the kind of attacks and distortion that came. This election obviously was an anomaly. We've never had an election quite like this one. Are there any steps now that, based upon this experience in 2020, that you have acquired or learned so that if we face a similar situation, and hopefully and prayerfully we will not, but are we prepared to deal with a situation like the one we've just come through in another election?
We have to continually assess and improve the work of the city and the county and the state to make sure we're doing everything we can to consistently improve. And one of the most important things I saw that's needed is even more voter education and more outreach to communicate to voters their rights. I mean, we're still in a situation where about 250,000 Detroiters voted. That's about half the citizen population. We would love to see more when you had some precincts, some communities with 80% turnout across the state. So we have to, I think, do more to engage citizens and educate them so that they can proactively address make sure they can vote, but also encourage others to vote and address misinformation. I mean, we saw very terrible robocalls targeting Detroit citizens, targeting folks in Flint, saying if you vote by mail, these terrible things will happen. And we know that's not true. And in fact, in communities that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, like Detroit, like Flint, like African-American communities all across the state that have experienced the disparate impact of COVID-19. We needed more than ever to ensure people would feel safe voting. And so continuing to educate people about their choices to vote in the pandemic or not, so that they know they don't have to risk their health and can choose a convenient way to cast their ballot and trust that, especially, a lot of Detroiters haven't voted absentee before. So having them vote absentee for the first time because of the pandemic and they don't want to vote in person is a big ask for some citizens, for some communities, particularly some of our older citizens. And so doing that voter education is an ongoing need that we all have to do, I think, in the months ahead, because there's another election, as you know, right around the corner next year in the city. So there's more we can do there, and also encourage more people to serve as poll workers and making sure we don't have shortages there so that we can continue to make Detroit accessible for everyone.
Absolutely. We won't have Donald Trump to deal with next year. Attorney Hollowell, I just have to say it, man. In talking to a lot of people, this was a gangster move on the part of the president. I've said it and I'll say it again. If we were in a different country and the leader of the country tried to shut down the post office, formed lines or created lines and had lines because of the removal of drop boxes, the removal of early voting, and to tell people that it's not safe to do that and it's rigged. If we were in another country and the leader said, I'm not stepping down unless I win, if the leader shifted his military people from various positions, if he fired the head of the elections commission who simply reported that this is the fairest election we've ever had, we've never had an election as secure as this one, and then to use the people who are appointed to certified election. Say, don't y'all certify. Call legislators to Washington, to his house, and entertain them. And they huddle together to talk about how we can delay this. Put them up at his hotel where they drinking Dom Perignon and having hors d'oeuvres if that was another country, we would call that a coup.
Well, they do have that in other countries, but they have them in countries that are dictatorships. And
Absolutely.
So this is really an episode out of The Sopranos, where you have a president that calls members of the state, leaders of the state legislature.
And they go.
And they take the meeting.
Yes.
To meet with him, to talk about ways in which they can maybe subvert the election. That is a disgrace. You do see that in dictatorships. Now, it could very well be of course, the president doesn't want to go, knows he's lost the election, because once you've left the presidency, you're subject to criminal prosecution, and there are a lot of prosecutions out there. So he's probably holding on to his furniture and not wanting to leave this office at all. But we're in a different world. And we're in this COVID world, for example, right now. And certain things that are happening today will never go back. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I work at an office downtown. I'm pretty much one of the only people in that building because so many people are working remotely. And what we found is that some people can work efficiently remotely. So businesses are rethinking the way in which you're entering the workforce. By the same token, we've now gone through an election which is incredibly unusual because it's an election during a pandemic. Mm-hmm. As a general rule, I used to serve on the Elections Commission for the City of Detroit when I was Corporation Counsel, which is made up of the City Clerk, the Corporation Counsel, and the President of the City Council. And so as a general rule, a third of the ballots that are cast in Detroit elections are by absentee voters, whereas in this election, it was over 2/3. Mm-hmm. It shifted because people, they didn't want to go out there and get sick, or they didn't want to expose themselves. But as we look at, as voting advocates, things about changes in the system that could make things better, we should do everything we can to make sure that elections are free and fair and convenient for all, and that every vote is counted. And so now that we've done these absentee votes or votes by mail, a lot of people are going to want to continue to do that, mm-hmm. and that's not a bad thing. On the other hand, it creates stresses in the system that have to be fixed, and you're going to need cooperation in order to fix those stresses. What do I mean by those stresses? You got all these absentee ballots. On election day, you go in there and you put your ballot out of its secrecy sleeve into the voting machine, and it's counted right there. Okay, that's one part of the election. But the other part of the election is if you've mailed your ballot in, that's a separate part that's counted by these absentee counting boards. They can't start counting those ballots by law until the last minute. Mm-hmm. We need legislation which would say, as soon as those ballots come in, why don't you start counting them then? Or a couple weeks out, like other states do. Let's take the drama out of it and take the pressure off of those election workers who have to go through really specific training in order to handle not just election day, but how do you handle those mail-in ballots, and you got to wait until the last minute to start counting them. We need changes in state law to reflect the changing times that we live in. So just like General Motors and Ford are making decisions about, are we going to let people start to work remotely? We need to also think in terms of voting. If we're going to continue to vote by mail, which is a pretty good idea, and it's convenient, let's get rules in place that allows us to do that more efficiently.
Secretary Benson, one of the beauties of Michigan now is the early voting, same-day voting, registration vote, the no-excuse absentee voting. I mean, many of us worked on those initiatives, those ballot initiatives, and now they've kicked in. And you see the rewards from it. You have a much greater participation. Obviously, the COVID-19 kicked in as well. But as Attorney Hollowell just talked about, as we go forward, are there some things that we need to do? I mean, the early voting, I know you were pushing for a count to begin much earlier, and the legislature did not go with that in the way that many of us felt that they should, to allow us to start counting earlier than that, to really get all that in. What kind of things should happen in Michigan in order for us to be even more efficient?
I think as Butch was saying, there's a lot of legislative changes that we need to continue and that other states have in place to make it easier for people to get their ballots, to return their ballots, and then to allow citizens to have their ballots be processed prior to Election Day. I found it notable that during the State Board of Canvassers, the one member of the Board of Canvassers who abstained from the vote talked about Florida as an example that we should try to follow, noting how efficient they had tabulated their absentee ballots. And I found that so ironic because Florida can actually start counting their ballots 3 weeks prior to the election.
3 weeks.
And,
3 weeks prior to the election.
All these other things that Florida has that we were asking our state legislature to give us that they never did. But that pre-processing, as Butch mentioned, is such a key important thing when it comes to simply also giving our clerks the time and space to count those absentee ballots without that time crunch and the pressure that we saw this year with everything happening on Election Day or the day after. Now, we got through this year, importantly, quite well through a lot of teamwork and support, but we can't do that it's not sustainable to do that every year. And so we're going to have to change our laws to be like Florida and a few other states in that regard. The other thing I think that's really important to hone in on is I always want to look at when we have a community where there's 50% turnout or communities where turnout is even lower than that or precincts, what can we do to get more people voting? And one of the things I've seen and had conversations about is how many people think because of your criminal history or because of any other challenges, even parking tickets, that you can't vote or have a fear of voting, that something will happen or bad will happen, particularly with police or others at the polls on Election Day. And of course, it's simply none of that's true. You can vote in Michigan regardless of your criminal history, yet we see consistent attacks of the right to vote that try to make people feel that they can't vote because of those things. And so, educating voters about their rights, ensuring they're informed, getting returning citizens voter registration forms, which we've started doing with state prisons and are going to be working to do that with Wayne County and other local prisons as well to make sure people have the information they need as returning citizens to be active voters as well, and engaging other communities, homeless communities, other areas, other places where people don't have as ease of access to even getting to a polling place. And so a lot of that, and that all is captured by voter education. A lot of times it's been on groups like the Detroit branch or League of Women Voters or others to do that work, which is so critical and important. And I think obviously that has to continue, but the state also has a responsibility as well to educate and empower voters to use the democracy that is the base and foundation for everything else that we do. So I think increased voter education and really doing a deep dive to improve the laws in our state to make voting easier, even more so, and looking at what we could learn from these past 2 years, which were the first under the proposal that amended our state constitution to give citizens the right to vote absentee or the right to register and vote on Election Day. So now that we have some data around that, let's look in and see what did and didn't work so we can continue to improve that system as well.
Attorney Holloway, I wore my shirt, Take Your Souls to the Polls, on purpose because it shows the battle that we've come through. Are we safe as we come to a conclusion? Are we safe? Do you see any other legal initiatives or challenges that we might expect from this administration? And if so, because you've been asked to counsel the Detroit branch NAACP and to advise them on election procedures, et cetera. And as an attorney who does this, we're concerned about that. And so do you see any other area that we might be vulnerable where these folk can come in and try to mess with the election, or are we done? Is it a done deal at this point?
No, we're not done. And you asked the question, are we safe? We are unsafe, and unsafe at any speed. That's why we need the NAACP to be continuously vigilant in protecting the right to vote, our most sacred right. Our vote is our power. And yes, we need to take our souls to the polls. Mm-hmm. And we did take our souls to the polls. But we also need to make sure that when we got to the polls and those ballots that we cast are counted. There are some other structural things that are on the horizon. and that we have to keep our eye on. So we passed a new law in 2018 which says that instead of having the state legislature, which right now is controlled by Republicans in both the Senate and the House, drawing the districts for Congress and for the state representatives in the state Senate, it's now been moved to an independent election commission. Thank goodness we have Secretary Benson kind of overseeing that process, but it's now an independent commission. What we know is that we have more Democrats in Michigan than we have Republicans, and yet we have a majority of our state Senate seats and a majority of our state representative seats, as well as our congressional seats held by Republicans. They draw those districts in a way to unfairly disadvantage, particularly communities of color. And so as we look, decennial census is done every 10 years. Last one was done in 2010. This new one is being done in 2020. As we get until this new commission that starts to kick in, and they're already selecting those members, and they're going to go to work to redraw those numbers. When they redraw those districts, and they should be square and fair, we're going to have more people who are reflecting communities of color in the state Senate and in the state House and in the U.S. House of Representatives. That needs to work. That's one of the most important structural changes that is going to happen in a Michigan election law in many, many, many decades. And so we'll now have fairer districts, meaning we're going to have greater representation of Detroit and Flint and Saginaw and Pontiac and Lansing in the state legislature. Yes, we do control, that is, Democrats, the governor and the attorney general, secretary of state, both U.S. senators. On the other hand, they're doing a lot of things in the state house and the state senate that we don't agree with, and it's imbalanced because of the way they drew those districts. That is going to change, and we have to keep our eye on that process to make sure that it works well. That's the biggest structural thing on the horizon.
Secretary Benson, before I let you go, I just want to find out, I know that you talk to other secretaries of state around the country, and you all compare notes. You've gone through all of this thing together. As you look at the next election and as you take the temperature of the people in the community, people were very concerned about their votes counting. They wanted them to be certified. We did not take it lightly that the African-American vote could have been disposed of, which would have wreaked havoc on us who try to encourage people to register to vote, to go vote, and how important voting is. Just before you depart, what do you say to the people in our communities about their vote and the security of it and the steps that the Secretary of State's office and others are taking to make sure that their votes count and that they are protected? Is there any message that you want to leave to the people of Michigan, and particularly those people of color, African Americans and others, who are always at risk of this kind of nonsense?
Reverend, as you started talking about tonight about what our nation has endured these past 4 years, we saw leadership manipulate the boundaries of norms in our country, corruption, misuse and abuse of authority like we've never seen before in the history of our country. And what we have to remember, and what we saw this month, was that the only thing, we saw the courts manipulated, we saw Congress and the U.S. Senate brought to a halt or manipulated. Of course, the Supreme Court appointment really is a great example of that. Norms ignored and history, unappreciated and not respected. The only thing that could stop that, the only thing that changed that ended that, was people voting. That was it. The abuse of power at that level has been shown it could overcome and manipulate almost anything except democracy. That truly is our strongest weapon at protecting our country and ourselves and our communities from those who would seek to abuse authority and corrupt our country to serve their own ends. And so the most important thing to take away from this election is that more people voted than ever before in our state's history. And we can do better next time because, we saw 250,000 people vote in Detroit. We could do better. We can get more people out voting. We can get more voices heard in Flint and elsewhere, Benton Harbor, Pontiac. But we're marching forward, but with such power that, as you know, those who seek to abuse that authority, as we saw so for this past 4 years, also try to silence the voices of the most powerful people in this country, our voters, so that they could continue abusing the authority of this country and the leadership therein. So I say all that to say that take great pride in knowing that by voting and only by voting was there a change in our a historic change, an election of the first woman of color to serve in the White House. But it was only the vote that made that happen. It was only citizens voting that made that happen. My job and the lawyer's job and others was just to make sure that people could vote and that when they did vote, those votes counted. And so that's my job. But I don't get to do that if people don't vote. And none of anything that we're doing matters if people don't vote. And nothing changes if people don't vote. And so that's the story of this election. What ruled the day, what ensured victory for the people in this city and in this country, what obliterated the efforts to disenfranchise citizens, what stopped them from happening was that so many people voted, was that so many people showed up at that Wayne County Board of Canvassers meeting to say, you're not going to take away my vote, and tell the truth. They just simply told the truth. We had a fair election. There's no reason to do that. It was people's voices and the votes that made all the difference this year, that changed everything, just as it's changed history throughout. So we'll have more opportunities next year with the city election and, of course, in 2022 and beyond to continue to exercise that power. But just all I've seen in this past month is how undeniable and preeminent that power of the vote really is. And we all decide, you all decide, the community decides whether to use that power or not. No one else makes that decision. Although, of course, we all make it easier for those decisions to be made by making it easier to vote, by registering voters and all the rest. But unless those citizens also choose to vote, all of it, falls apart. So I want to leave you with my gratitude and thank you, because we saw voters in the city of Detroit, just as voters in Milwaukee, just as voters in Atlanta, just as voters in Philadelphia, change the course of this country's history yet again, and bring it forward. And so the nation is in your debt as a result of that leadership, of that power that was exerted in Detroit and communities all across the country. And don't forget that next time someone tells you that your vote doesn't count or your vote doesn't matter. It is the most powerful tool that we have and that you have, and that what we saw this month is that tool was used to ensure that our country moved a little bit towards justice and away from the corruption that we've experienced these past 4 years.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. John Lewis has said it well, that the vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool that we have. Attorney Holloway, I know that you don't mind suing people that need to be sued.
That's right.
I know that you have a reputation of going at folk. What would you say, as the lawyer who was accustomed to these kind of battles, what would you say to people to kind of give them any kind of comfort about voter protection, and if folk come wrong in this matter going forward, what should our posture be?
We need to double down on what we know to be true and what our fundamentals are. For example, at the NAACP, I was honored for all those years to serve as your general counsel here at the NAACP. And, in our bailiwick, we stand on 3 pillars. One is a fair criminal justice system. We're going to have to work on that to get individuals, for example, who get convicted of these mandatory minimums, get away from that. We're going to need to push for legislation on that. Second, we believe in an equal access to a quality education. Educational reform has got to be at the forefront if we ever want our children to have the same kinds of opportunities that we have and to do better. And third, the right to vote. which is our topic tonight, to double down on that and to make certain reforms that we've talked about today. We cannot take some of these things for granted, as we talked about before, which is why voter education is so important. But you look back, when I say double down, there's a war room that's run by the NAACP every year. Well, that's the gold standard. So if there's something that's not going right with a voting machine in one particular area, or if we see certain challengers from Grand Rapids coming in and making a fuss at some other kind of polling location, we have lawyers that are trained, that go out into the field and take affidavits, sworn statements, that we go into court when we have evidence of this kind of wrongdoing, but we do it right. We do it methodically. We have to continue to double down on those kinds of things in order to make sure that when it's serious, you go to the NAACP, and that really is the case. We cannot take our eye off the ball for 1 second, because this is hardball in Washington. It's hardball in Lansing. It's hardball in some of these other areas. And so our preparations for dealing with some of these kinds of issues, it's not glamorous. It's just hard work and training and making sure that you have a good strategy and that you execute it. Why? Because this is how we express our most fundamental way in which we interface with our democracy. And African Americans have bled for this right to vote. We need to do all that we can to make sure that those votes are counted so that we can hold our elected officials accountable.
Thank you, Attorney Hollowell, and thank you, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. And I do want to thank all of the folk in Detroit and all around the state of Michigan who did vote, who did come out, who did support the right thing, who did do what is essential to be done, and that is to cast their vote and their ballot and to have their ballots counted. I want to wish everybody a very blessed and happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you next time right here on The Turning Point. Thanks for tuning in.